another dyeing tutorial today. Now this tutorial will slot in between the ones I've already done. So tutorial 1 shows all the preparation work and tutorial 3 shows like the washing of the yarn and finishing it off. So this is the section in the middle, which is just the dyeing technique and showing you how to dye. So if you haven't watched part 1 already, then I would suggest you go and watch that first before you watch this one. So what we're going to be doing today is some tonal yarn. I don't often dye up just a purely tonal because I always kind of like adding a few speckles or, you know, a few other colours, but I just thought it might be fun just to dye up a, you know, quite a basic tonal, just so that you've got, you know, a starting point really. If you've never dyed before, this is a good way to get going on it. So I've just sort of made up a colour this morning, and Dan suggested that I dye up some yarn for him to knit some socks with, and I have got some DK weight soaking, which is a 75-25 merino nylon, so it's perfect for socks for Dan to knit. So that's what I'm going to be doing. So I'm going to use 2 dye colours. I'm using pink and I'm using crimson. And I use these in a certain way, and I'll explain what I do in a second. But the first thing I'm going to do is I will put my mask on. Obviously I spoke about the safety aspect in part 1 of these tutorials, so I'll put my mask on, and then what I'm going to do is I'll take my pink, which is the lighter of the 2 colours, and I'm going to pop some of the pink straight into the dye pot before the yarn goes in. I think actually I'm just going to add a bit more pink because I can just tell, just from experience, because I'm dyeing 2 skeins and I just want that to be a bit of a deeper shade of pink. So I'm going to add in just another half of I use an 1/8 of a teaspoon measuring, so I've put in an 1/8 already. I'm going to just add in another half. Okay, so the dye's in now and I'm giving it a nice stir. We want to make sure that we've not got any little clumps of dye anywhere, because if you put your yarn into the pot and you've still got those little clumps, you'll get clumps of dye on the actual yarn, and what we're aiming for this time is a nice even coverage of the dye. You know, we're looking for a tonal rather than speckled or variegated. So that's had a nice stir. So now I'm going to go and grab my 2 skeins of yarn and pop them into the pot. Okay, so we've got our 2 skeins. This is a DK weight, as I said, already been pre-soaked with some citric acid, and we had citric acid also in the pot. You know, I've said this previously in the previous tutorial. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to dump these into the pot, and I'm kind of going to drop them in, not really fast. Because what will happen is the yarn that goes in first is going to get the highest concentration of dye, and then as you put the rest in, that will be a bit lighter. So that's how you're going to get a nice tone through this first colour. So we're going to drop it in and just let it drop in, and then what I tend to do is just keep hold of those ends, get my big spoon and just give it a little push in. Just make sure that you're getting dye on all bits of the yarn, because sometimes it can hide under there. You know, it can get sort of just clump together the yarn, and we do want all of the yarn to get some amount of colour. And you can see it's fairly instant that that dye disappears. If you look at the pot now, it's virtually clear. It does go in very, very quickly. Because this is at a nice, it's not even at simmering point this yet, it's just, you know, just hot, the water. And you can see already you have got some nice tones going on there. It's darker here, it's lighter here, and it's a mid-tone here. So, you know, you could just stop at that point and, you know, I would let it come to a simmer to make sure that we've got it at the right temperature, you know, where that dye is going to really set nicely. Or you can go ahead and do just the extra little stage that I do just to get even more tones in. So I'm just going to let that come to a simmer and then we'll do the next stage. Okay, so that's at a nice simmer now. All of that dye is exhausted that we had in there, and you can see we've got some lovely tones of pink going on. But what I want to do is just add in another layer of colour, just to give another bit of depth. What I tend to do is try and choose two colours that are kind of similar tones, but one will be either more vibrant than the other, or one will be darker than the other. In this case, I'm using pink and crimson. Now, crimson has obviously got some red in it, but it's also got some pink. So I'm going to use not as much of the crimson, I'm just going to use 1/2 of an 1/8 of a teaspoon and just see what that looks like, because we can always add more, but obviously we can't take it away. So I'm just going to add in 1/2 of that. Now, the way that I do it, I don't know whether this is a bonkers way to do it or what, but this is just how I do it. What I'm going to do is I lift the skeins out of the pot. I'll tell you now before I put my mask on. I'll lift the skeins out of the pot, I'll get my dye, dump it into the water, stir it around, again distribute it all nicely, and then put the skeins back in the pot. So I'm going to lift the skeins out of the pot so it's out of the water. I'm adding in just 1/2 a teaspoon of the crimson. Give it a stir. Make sure we've got no lumps. And I'm going to dump it back in the pot. Now, what I do this time is I don't really mess with it. I just let it sit. So that what happens is let me just put that back on. Some areas of the yarn that are on the bottom are going to get quite a lot of that crimson dye. The other ones that are on the top here, this, as you can see, is not really going to get very much at all. Some of it will soak upwards, and then also you've got the yarn in the middle of the skein that's kind of trapped, so that won't get very much dye either. So you'll get a very, very tonal, almost variegated, I suppose, distribution of the colour through the skein. So I will now just leave that, bring it to the simmer, and then once it's at that simmering point, let it simmer for a couple of minutes, and then I'll just turn the heat off. Let the dye pot cool down and exhaust completely, and then carry on with stage 3, washing the yarn and drying it, and it'll be all finished. So that's how I do my tonal yarns.